Amen. Again, church, really good to be here with you. If you have a Bible with you, I'd love it if you'd open that up with me to the book of Genesis again. Depending on the layout of your Bible, we may have moved into page 2. But for a lot of you, we will probably still be on page number 1. So it'll be easy for you to find. And today we're going to be in Genesis 1:26 down to chapter 2, verse 3. So 1:26 to 2:3. I'm going to start by reading that, and then we'll get into it together. This is Genesis chapter 1. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the 7th day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. If someone were to ask you today, "Who are you?" what might you say in response to that question? So I imagine that most of us, again, it'd be kind of maybe even a startling question. It's so foundational. Who are you? I imagine most of us might start with our name, right? And maybe from there we might speak about where we live or where we're from. We might move on to talk about what we do for work. If they press further, we might tell them about our family, friends, maybe some of our hobbies. Maybe we might begin speaking about our preferences and likes and dislikes, or the things that drive us crazy or something like that. But what if you were to strip all of those kind of superficial things away and really try to get to the foundation of the question? Who are you? At the most deep level, what would you say to that? What would you say? And as we gaze at kind of the landscape around us, it turns out that on several levels, we have been on a decades-long journey of finding very different ways to answer that question. Very different ways to answer that question. For example, I'll just highlight 2 kind of arenas in which we see this shifting. At a scientific level, ever since Darwin published his On the Origin of Species in the year 1859, we have been reframing the way we think about ourselves scientifically as a species, right? So traditionally, there would have been very few people who would have thought about that question or the answer to that question, who are we, without some sort of appeal to the divine. And that may not be Christianity. It certainly was for many parts of the world, but even in other nations that were not Christian, they would have had other divine sort of answers to that question. It would have been rooted in some kind of creation account, most likely, right? That would have been the norm, some sort of religious underpinning. But Darwin's theory of evolution, through the unguided random process of natural selection, opened up a whole new possibility, a whole new way of understanding what it means to become human. And I would say that's become sort of the dominant idea or understanding in the secular Western world. And in short, we might say this: to be human in a Western secular way of thinking is to say that you are just the result of one really long random accident, right? One really long random accident. We just started with material, and that material started doing some things, and life burst out of that, and that life through natural selection just started going, and things started changing, and we are here today just because of millions and millions of years, totally by chance, in an unguided scientific or natural process. So you could run this over, and we might end up with an entirely different world. So, and some scientists will even use kind of shocking language. They'll say humans are basically just walking, thinking bags of bone and meat and flesh, honestly. That would be the prevailing view of what it means to be human scientifically. But there's a shift happening at another level too. It's not just scientifically. We might say socially or culturally or even psychologically. Traditional cultures, again, highly valued the role of the community when it came to something like identity formation. And by that, I just mean that process of discerning, who am I? Like, what am I in the world? Who am I? And so they often, traditional cultures would, as you would grow up, you would look outside of yourself to your family, to your community, to your neighbors, and at some level, they would help shape your identity. You would kind of conform to the group at large. So it would be more of like a community-based form of identity. This is why in older generations, like if your father did something, you would do that too. I come from a long line of farmers, 7 generations. So my father farmed, his father farmed, and his father farmed, and his father farmed. And that's just generally speaking how it happened. The world you grew up in, that shaped who you were and what you did and all of those things. But again, that's been shifting as well, pretty radically, from a world in which we look outside of us to our community to a one in which now we basically, to the exclusion of all other voices, look to ourselves and look within us to determine who we most truly are. Now, we're gonna come back to that in a little bit and dive into that more deeply. Now, both of these, again, represent 2 very radical shifts in the way we think about and answer that question. And as such, there's a lot of confusion and chaos in the world right now. It turns out like who you think you are really matters actually for how you behave and how you live. If you think that humanity is just the result of one really long accident, that has implications for how we live and exist in the world. But here's what I want to do today, okay? I want us to ask that sort of question. Who are we? What does it mean to be human? Really big question. And then I want us to really look at what Genesis 1 has to say about that question, about what it has to say about how we think about that. And as you can imagine today, this is a question that is deeply personal, but it's also a question that is deeply relevant. As a matter of fact, there is no one who is not touched by this question. Everyone in this room, like this has implications for us, for our own self-understanding and for how we live in the world. And so that's really important. Now, you might be here today and you might say, oh man, Genesis, this book was written thousands of years ago by an ancient culture. Like, what sort of wisdom could there be for us in a book like this? In fact, maybe you might be thinking, this is just going to be harmful and backwards. Why would we be looking at that? And I understand, honestly, why you might think that in our world today. But I, again, just want to encourage you as we come to the book of Genesis to have an open mind to see what it's trying to say about what it means to be human, and then see if this maybe doesn't offer a much more compelling, much more solid, much more stable answer for that question that will lead to human flourishing. Maybe you'll find that to be true. Now, really quickly, admittedly, this has been a painful week for me as I've studied because there's so much to be said about this passage. And so there was a point at which I was like, maybe I've got like 3 things I want us to talk about. And there's a point at which I was like, maybe I should do a sermon on each of these. And I didn't do that, okay? But so there's a lot of things we could say that we won't be able to say today. Hopefully in the coming weeks we'll be able to address some more of those things. But for now, we're going to be talking about 3 things that I think Genesis would want us to see, Genesis chapter 1, as essential to our humanity, to what it means for us to be human. And so we're going to get right into those. And the first thing is this. Genesis would want us to see that to be human is to be an image bearer of God. Now, I want us to pick it up again in verse 26, where we started our reading, and see. And remember, this is on the 6th day of creation. So we've gone through the creation days. This is day number 6. This is what Genesis 1 says. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Now, as we read through that, immediately you're going to see there that there is a theme or an image that is dominating this discussion of God's creation of humanity, and that theme is the fact that human beings are image bearers of God. They're image bearers of God. That's the first thing that God says when it comes to man. Let us make man in our image, right? In other words, there is no way for us to understand what it means to be human from Genesis 1's point of view without understanding what it means to be an image bearer. Now, this concept, like, it would be really hard for me to overstate this, has been foundational for Christian theology throughout the ages. And I would say, even though our post-Christian world has moved on from Christianity, it is still foundational for so much of what we value in our world today. In Latin, it's the phrase, the imago Dei, right? The image of God is the language that theologians often use to describe this. Now, as with a lot of things, as we've talked about in the book of Genesis, there's a lot of debate throughout the history of the church about what it means to be an image bearer. So you'll have people saying, it's about our rationality and the way we can think. Some people will say, it's about our emotional response. Or others will say it's about our empathy, all of these different things, right? And I don't want to wade into all of those debates, but for now, what I want to focus on is just the dominant image that language kind of communicates to us, right? To be an image bearer of God means that at some level, okay, whatever we think about the details of how that works out, at some level, to be human is to reflect God. Right? That's what an image is, right? To be an image bearer of God means there is a God likeness to humanity. God says, let us create man in our image, in our likeness. Now, we might say that God has left his imprint on us in some way so that when we look at one another, there's a sense in which we should see something of who God is as we gaze at fellow image bearers around us. Like we reflect God to the world and to others. Now, again, we need to be really careful here. That we are created in the image of God does not blur that kind of fundamental distinction we talked about in week number 1 between creator on the one hand and then creature on the other. Right? So we don't get to day 6 and God says, let us make man in our image, and all of a sudden we're like, whoa, maybe that division and distinction between God as creator and us as creature has become blurred, and maybe we're like semi-divine. That's not at all what Genesis chapter 1 is saying. There's still that fundamental distinction exists, and yet God's telling us that there is a sense in which we reflect God. We image God to the world around us. Now, one of the things that does mean, though, is that the image of God on humanity does set humanity apart from the rest of creation. It doesn't remove us from the grouping of creation, but it does make us distinct from the rest of creation. So, for example, God does not say to any of the animals that he creates that you are created in my image. Not at all, right? There are similarities between humanity and the rest of creation, and yet there's this really clear distinction here. It's when God creates man, he says, let's create man in our image, right? So there's something different here, which means, okay, church, however much you love your precious pet, your dog, your cat, your hamster, your goldfish, whatever it is, like there is a value to humanity that so far surpasses any of the created world that it's an entirely different sort of category of value and worth. We would think of the most despicable person in our day and say that person as an image bearer of God has more value, right? Is valuable in a way that's unique to the rest of the created world. It also means, church, that you are not just an accident. Right? To be created in the image of God means that you are not the result of millions of years and chance and randomness and natural processes. It means that you were created by God, every single one in this room. And I think this is where the doctrine of the Imago Dei becomes kind of radical, because this is true of every single human. Every single human who's ever lived. Genesis 1 says they are an image bearer of God. Now, when that doctrine hits history, like that is a radical reshaping of the way we understand the world, right? You want to go back to ancient Rome. You know, we tend to think that in every culture we have the same value for life that we have in our culture. And I would say that's just not the case historically. You go back to ancient Rome and you see the way the strong treated the weak, and you would understand that is a culture that does not have the belief that every human being is created in the image of God and bears that stamp of value and worth because God is creator and because God has designed them. Genesis 9:6 says it like this: whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. And that's after the fall, right? So we might think, well, maybe Genesis 1, that's a world where we're image bearers, but certainly after sin enters the world, that's not the case anymore. And we would say certainly there's something about that image that has been marred or shattered in some way that's not as clear as it should be. And yet Genesis 9 says that we still bear the image of God and therefore are worthy of value, of dignity, of respect, of honor, and no one is to be treated as less than that. That's what it means. Now, the other thing that I'd want to say about this is this: when you read this, okay, you perceive that there's some sort of disconnect between the anthropology of Genesis, or understanding of what it means to be human, and the one put forward in our world today, you would be entirely correct. In fact, we would just say that this view of humanity in Genesis 1 and our world's view of humanity couldn't be more at odds today. So again, if you were to go out on the streets and ask the average Westerner in Canada or the US or in the UK or something like that and say, who are you? Same question we posed in the introduction. Again, they might start by telling you their name and where they're from and all of those things. Again, you keep pressing deeper, you will find evidence most likely of something that kind of scholars call expressive individualism. And that's just a fancy way of saying something like this. Basically, in essence, it means that for most people, identity is kind of self-referential. Self-referential. So the individual goes on some sort of journey of exploration, and that journey is not outside of themselves, but it's a journey into themselves, kind of into their own heart, into their own desires and experiences. We go deep into ourselves. We explore the different feelings and desires that we feel and experience there, and we find the one that we think is most true to who we are, that is most fundamental to our identity. We find that, and then we emerge from that journey of exploration with the truth of who we are, and we express that to the world. Expressive individualism, right? It's a radically individualistic process because basically it says that nobody else has the right to tell me who I am, but only myself. Nobody else has the right to do that. And if we're honest, the heroes in our culture today are those who do that journey of self-exploration. They find themselves and they emerge victorious with their true identity, even if it flies in the face of what all the people around them are saying, their family members, their religion, their traditional cultures, all of those things. Those are the people we celebrate. Just insert any Disney movie, basically, over the last 30 years into that paradigm, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about, right? All of these situations, we have this lead character from some kind of oppressive culture. They want them to be one thing. The lead character's like, that's not who I'm going to be. And that's the general idea that we see in our world. Now, maybe you hear and you think that and you're like, well, that makes sense, right? Like, why else? Why would I let anyone else tell me who I am? Maybe you're like, that just seems the most natural way for me. Like, why would I not be the one to determine who I am? Like, doesn't that make the most sense? And again, fair question. Maybe that's an honest question that you have, and I can understand that. But really quickly, we don't have time to dive deeply into all of these things. I would just want to point out to you that process is actually really unreliable. As much as that's kind of become dogma for our day, I don't actually think that leads to healthy human flourishing. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of reasons really quickly. First, all of us know that when we dive in and look at our heart and look at our desires, we don't find that all of our desires are always aligned or in tune with one another. You know that. Your desire, when you get down there, you don't find that everything is in this orderly fashion and all of my desires are aiming in the same way and it's really clear which one is the true me. What you find is that you've got all kinds of different desires, sometimes that are completely at odds with one another. For example, you might find in your heart a desire to be healthy, to eat well, to be fit, to look good, to be active, all of those things. And on the other hand, you just want to eat whatever you want, right? You want to eat whatever you want, and you don't want to do the hard work, and yet at the same time, you want to be healthy, you want to do a lot. Which one? Which is the one? Or we might say maybe at an even more personal level, you might find in your heart desire to be a part of a stable family, to be married, to raise up kids in a stable home environment, and yet on the other hand, you might realize you've got a desire to sleep with whoever you want, whenever you want to do it. Or you might find both of those things in your heart. Which one is the true you? right? So this idea that we can go down there and find something that's like clear and obvious and united and aligned with everything that we want, I think, if we're really honest, is probably a myth. And that leads us to the second one, which is that inevitably the desires that we end up choosing to express ourselves to the world are usually the ones that our culture tells us are honorable and worthy, right? We receive a grid from the world that we live in of the sorts of things that are valuable and acceptable and that are good and that are beautiful, and we receive that from the world. And inevitably, it means that we don't go down there from a neutral position, but we've got all of these ideas in our head. And so inevitably, the thing that we find there will most likely be the thing that aligns with everything that we see going on around us, which is kind of the irony of the process, church, because often around this process, you see the language of freedom being used, right? Like formerly I was enslaved to all of these expectations and all of these things, and now I've been set free. And I understand, why people use that language, but if you really think about it, really what's going on here, most of the time, is that we are just exchanging one set of cheerleaders for another set of cheerleaders, right? Or if you want to be more extreme and talk about the language of slavery, we are exchanging one set of chains for another set of change, which is the cultural values and expectations that the world places on around us. You see what I'm saying? So both of those things, we could go further. We could talk about the deceitfulness of the human heart and all of those things. I won't even go in there. But when you look at that process and you're really honest, we've got to understand that that is not a reliable foundation for us to build our lives on. And that's not even getting into the fact that over time, these desires change. They're changing all of the time and shifting. Like that's just not a good foundation for which we should build the framework and the house of our lives upon. In contrast to that, Genesis 1 tells us that a more solid and reliable way to understand who you are is actually to look to the one who made you. Actually to look to your Creator, because it says you were made in His image. You were made to reflect Him, and you have value as one who is created and designed by God. It doesn't matter what you've done, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter where you've been, it doesn't matter where you're from, it doesn't matter how much money you make. God says He looks at all of us, every single human, born in the image of God, made in the image of God. It says you are worthy, you are valuable, you are honorable, and there is dignity there. John Stott said it like this. He said, the biblical revelation reminds us that human beings are not self-explanatory. In other words, we can't explain ourselves with only ourselves. They derive their meaning from outside themselves, from God, in whose image they are made. We are not autonomous individuals creating ourselves constantly by the decisions and choices we make. No, we are images, we are reflections. The dignity of our humanity is derivative. It comes from Him whose image we bear. We are dependent beings. In other words, we will never understand the deepest level who we are unless we look to our Creator. It's just impossible. If God created us, right, we look to the artist for the meaning and understanding of what it means to be human. Now, I wish I could say more about this. That's just one point today, so we got to move on. If you are interested in reading more, I would just want to make a couple really quick book recommendations. The first is a book by Tim Keller called Making Sense of God, which is awesome. He has a really great chapter on that and other things. And then as well, I've already mentioned this book, a book by Carl Trueman called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, or he's got a version of that is much more accessible called Strange New World, and I would just recommend pick that up if you have questions about that. Really helpful. That's the first thing. To be human is to be an image bearer of God. Number two, to be human or to be an image bearer is to be someone who has good and important work to do in the world. I want you to look with me again at verse 26. Look at what it says there, okay? Verse 26. Right after declaring His intention to create humans in His image, this is what God says next. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So what does it mean to be a human? Well, at the first level, it means to be an image bearer, but then we press further than that. Genesis 1 says that part of what it means to be an image bearer is to have dominion over the rest of His created world. Now, I want you to understand that maybe that language seems foreign to you. What does it mean to have dominion? That is royal language, right? To have dominion is to rule or to reign like a king or a queen, right? We sometimes use that language when we think of the monarchy or all of those things, right? To have dominion is to be a king over something and to rule or reign over that. So in his creation of humanity, listen to this, God is establishing image bearers who then at some level are responsible for ruling over the good world that he has made. And we would be really clear to say that this ruling and reigning over his world is not in an ultimate sense, right? God doesn't kind of delegate and then disappear, right? Maybe you've heard that language before where he's like, all right, world is done. You guys, this is on you. Image bearers, you look after it. I'm out of here. That's not the picture of Genesis 1. Rather, God is ultimately king. He is ruling and reigning over all things, and yet he invites his image bearers to join with him in this work of ruling over things. He invites us as partners. Scholars, again, use the language of vice regents who come under his authority and then rule or reign alongside of him as his image bearers. Now, to understand how utterly unique this would have been in the ancient world, I think it's helpful for us to kind of sample an alternative vision of what it means to be human from another ancient culture. So you remember, over the weeks we've been saying, Genesis is not alone. And was not alone in the ancient world. It was not written in a vacuum. There were other cultures that had their own versions of how the world was created and what it means to be humans. And one of those main ones, or predominant ones, was the Enuma Elish, coming out of ancient Babylonian culture. And they too had their understanding of what it means to be human. And so I just want to read a short account from that speaks about the purpose of humanity from the view of the gods who created the world. This is what it says. I know you're dying to hear from the Enuma Elish today, so here it is. It says this, arteries I will not, and bring bones into being. I will create Lulu, man, be his name. I will form Lulu, man, and let him be burdened with the toil of the gods, that they may freely breathe. They bound him, Kingu, held him before E, inflicted the penalty on him, severed his arteries, and from his blood he formed mankind, imposed toil on man, set the gods free. It's a pretty hopeful vision of mankind, right? Being formed out of the blood of this. Anyways, won't go there. A couple things I want you to notice, okay? First, notice that in the Enuma Elish, work is viewed as a burden, as something lowly and toilsome and beneath the dignity of the gods. You notice that? So they are tasked with this job of ruling the creation, and they look at one another like, we don't want to do this. This is hard work. What are we going to do? I know what we'll do. We'll create humanity basically as cheap slave labor. We'll create them. They do the work that we don't do so that we'll impose that toil on man so that we can breathe freely, so we can go free, we can put our feet up, and we don't have to deal with that. Right? That's the view of that. In contrast to that, the picture we get in Genesis of a God who dignifies work. He gives it meaning and purpose. In fact, it's clear. Genesis 2:1-3 makes it clear that what God is doing in creation is working. Like a master craftsman, he's applying his trade, creating things out of nothing. 3 times it says God rested from his work. More than that, it seems like God actually enjoyed it. Right? You see him doing his work and he steps back and he's like, man, that's good. This is good stuff. He does it again. He creates space. He steps back. It's good. He starts to fill it with life. He steps back. It's good. He creates humanity. He steps back and says, man, it's very good. Like a God who delights to do work, right? That's really, really important. So for Genesis, work is not something that's lowly and it's not something that's beneath the gods, but it's something that God actually does, and then it's something he invites humans in to take a part of. But then the second thing I want you to notice is this. In the Enuma Elish, the purpose of humanity is essentially to make the lives of the gods easier. That's it. If that's true, we are just here to do the work that some deities didn't want to do themselves. And we may not know it, but we're just kind of cheap slave labor so that they can put their... And I know no one believes the Enuma Elish anymore, right? But I'm just trying to help us understand how this lands would have landed in the ancient world. Right? So we do the toilsome work. We're the cheap slave labor. There's no value for humanity. There's no dignity there. There's no reason why we should respect one another or care about our fellow humans at all. But again, the picture of humanity in Genesis could not be more different and unique. In Genesis 1, we see that humans are image bearers created to rule and reign alongside God over his creation, doing good and meaningful work on his behalf. That's Genesis 1. Now, it's worth noting here that language of being an image bearer of God is also not unique to Genesis chapter 1. In fact, in the ancient world, again, there would have been a number of other cultures that would have used that same language of humans, but they would have only used it of their rulers or their kings. So an ancient pharaoh over Egypt might have referred to himself as an image of God. And so they would have viewed themselves as representatives of God, but it was only them, right? They were the rulers. They had the image of God. Everyone else was beneath them, and therefore they were tasked with ruling. Same in other cultures, right? Like it was focused on only the elite or the highest of the high, the rulers over. They were the image bearers, nobody else. But again, the radical thing about Genesis 1 is that language or that concept is kind of democratized so that everybody is a ruler. Everyone is a king or a queen. Everyone has that value or that dignity, and all human work is dignified in that way. From doctors and scientists to the prime minister or the president, all the way down to manual laborers or teachers or pastors, right? All of those things, all work that people do, Genesis 1 says is good and meaningful, as long as it's not working against, the goodness of God and the good of our fellow human, right? You see what I'm saying there? Like, this is really, really important. Now, I'm going to guess that that's often not our default way of thinking about the work that God has called us to in the world, right? When we think about that language of ruling and reigning, that feels foreign to us. I don't know, like you're maybe not thinking about that as you're raising young kids at home. You don't feel like a king or a queen over God's creation when you're doing your toilsome job or whatever that is, right? So what does that mean? What does that actually look like for us in the jobs that we do? Now, I think, again, we'll be helped by glancing down further and looking at Genesis 1, verse 28. And I just want to read verse 28, and then we'll circle back here. It says this, "And God blessed them and said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" So notice that charge to have dominion is repeated, verse 28. But then I also want you to notice that on top of that, we get this command and this blessing from God. It says, first of all, to be fruitful and multiply. So he's speaking about kind of procreation, the multiplication of humanity. But then it also says, fill the earth and subdue it. Now, that language of subduing might be surprising to us. You might be thinking, wait a minute. Didn't we just talk about last week, Genesis 1 is a world of order and beauty? Right, that God creates the world in an orderly way. It functions, it's fine-tuned. Everything is designed for the sake of human flourishing and for our good and to the glory of God. So what does it mean to subdue the earth? Like, what does that look like? And again, there's lots of things we could say there, but from the language of Genesis 1 and 2, as we'll see later, it seems to be the case that God created a world of order and beauty, but also a world that was filled with a sort of untapped potential. In other words, God creates this world in an orderly way and it's beautiful, and yet it's created in such a way that there's room, like everything is not done for us. There's room for us to step out into the world and cultivate it and make it fruitful and make it produce good things for us. There's good work for us to be done. We don't step into a world where nothing is left for us to do. Right? Theologian Al Wolters said it like this. He said, earthly creation preceding the events recorded in Genesis 3, the fall, is like a healthy newborn child. In every respect, it can be pronounced very good, but this does not mean that change is not required. Right? That's the like a healthy baby. You say it's very good. This is exactly but then we know that child is going to have to grow up. It's going to have to learn different things and all. And Al Wolters is saying this is the world that God created. It's orderly, it's beautiful, and it's good. And yet there's this sort of untapped potential to it, such that God can send humanity out into it and say, make it fruitful and subdue it. Put the raw resources of the world that are there for your good to work. Use your gifts, use your skills, bring order to it, and out of that, bring fruit and multiply, and do that for the good of humans and for the glory of God. And so historically, we look and we see humanity with artistic capabilities, right, who build beautiful buildings and write beautiful poems and sing beautiful songs, and they craft beautiful things. They build houses, they design, they plan, do all of those things. And all of that, we would say rightly, is in response to this mandate to fill the earth and subdue it. Often that will be referred to as the cultural mandate. Create culture, the things that we love and cherish and that are good for human flourishing. Now, again, here's what this means. It means that at some level, we were created for this sort of work. Now, depending on your job and how much you love that or hate that, you might be tempted to think that work is a result of the fall, right? Like in Genesis 1, no work at all, but it's only because of sin that we have to work in the world. But I want you to see that's not Genesis 1. Genesis is saying, before sin ever entered the world, this was part of God's good purpose for you, to be working, to be engaging in these ways. Yes, sin has made that work difficult. It's what we see as part of the curse. It's made it toilsome. It's made it at some level hard, and at some level it's a form of suffering, right? But at its essence, at its pure essence, it is a good thing, and that will be part of the new heavens and the new earth. Again, I hope that's not overwhelming for you, but you will work in eternity. Because work is good, and this is part of who we were created to be, to take the raw materials of creation that God made and organize those towards the flourishing of humanity and the glory of God. Now, again, there's a lot more that we could say about that, but for now, I just want you to know, Christian, that the work you do is important and valuable to God. This is important and valuable to God. From the things that are lowest in our culture's view of value to the things that are most respected, God says that your work has dignity, has meaning, it's pleasing to Him, and it's important for the flourishing of your fellow image bearer in the world, right? So if you're a stay-at-home mom dealing with the difficult task of raising kids, to love God and love their neighbor, that's not easy, right? But Genesis says that work is important and crucial. You are subduing the earth. You are bringing order and goodness as you raise your kids to love others and as you teach them about the created world. If you're a teacher in this room, right? You've got kids in your classroom, the chaos, all of that. Genesis 1 would say that the work that you do to educate and to help them understand the way the world works and help them to get along with one another, all those menial, frustrating tasks are valuable to God. They're an important part of your contribution. If you are an engineer designing buildings or roads or systems or whatever it is in an orderly way so that they're safe and that they're good for human, all of that is really, really important. If you're a nurse or a doctor, using your skills and training and compassion to work towards healing and wholeness for our minds and our bodies. If you're an artist, to create beautiful things that reflect the glory of God. All of that, Genesis says, is worthwhile and beautiful. To be an image bearer is to be invited into dignified and meaningful work, no matter how menial the task. Finally, number 3, and this might be the most important of all of them, to be an image bearer of God is to be created to dwell in the presence of God Himself and to be in fellowship with Him. Now, I'm going to be honest. I want to read Genesis 2, verses 1 to 3 again really quickly, but this one's going to take a little bit more work for us to understand. We'll get there. So Genesis 2, 1 to 3 says this, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished His work that He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from all His work that He had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all His work that He had done in creation." So in order for us to understand how it is that humans are created for the presence of God, there's two kind of ideas that we need to build together, and they kind of work together to show us what's going on in Genesis 1. And the first thing that we need to see is this, is that in many ways, what God is doing in Genesis 1, track with me here, as He's creating the world and ordering it and filling it, is He is creating a cosmic temple. Cosmic temple, that's Genesis 1. And at first that might surprise you. You might say, there's no language of temple here. What do you mean by temple? We don't see anything like that. Are you just reading that into the text? And I would say, you're right, we don't see that language explicitly in Genesis chapter 1, but there's something really interesting going on here. When Moses wrote the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, is designed in such a way that as you read through it, you are meant to see connections later on in the Pentateuch that help you understand what was going on earlier in the story, right? So we start at page 1 and we start reading through Genesis. We're like, okay, this is good. God is creating a good world, he's ordering it, and he's filling it. And then we move on, and we start to gain more understanding about creation as we read Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, the thing I want to draw your attention to specifically happens in the book of Exodus. Now, as we read through the story, we see God's people rescued from slavery. God brings them out into the wilderness. And then God begins to give Moses instructions for how he is supposed to build the tabernacle, right? Which is like a temple. It's the place where God dwells with humanity. And when we look at those instructions and all of the events surrounding the building of the tabernacle, there are all sorts of parallels that we are meant to see with God's creation of the world in Genesis chapter 1. Let me highlight a few of those for us here. Okay, first, in the same way that God's Spirit is hovering over creation in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, ready for God's creative work to happen, so also Exodus 31, verse 3 says that God fills certain craftsmen or artists with his Spirit for the work of creating the tabernacle. See that? Spirit of God is hovering, the world is created, God fills two craftsmen with his Spirit so that they can do the creative work of building the tabernacle. Second, the Hebrew phrase that Genesis 1 uses to describe the sun and the lights in the expanse that we saw in day 4, almost everywhere else in the Pentateuch, that word is the Hebrew word for a lamp that is used to describe the lamps that were furnishing the tabernacle. So we're meant to look back at Genesis 1 and see the sun and the moon and the stars are like the same as the lamps in the tabernacle. They provide light to the cosmic temple that is God's creation. Third, as the creation of the world takes 7 days, so also God gives 7 speeches to Moses with instructions for building of the tabernacle. And then finally, along with that, the language used of God in Genesis 2 that we just read, after he finishes the work, where he steps back and he finishes and he rests, is eerily similar, maybe eerily is not the right word, but strikingly similar to the language that is used of Moses when he finishes the tabernacle as well. There's a lot more we could say there, but I'll stop there. Basically, as we read through the Bible, we are meant to look back at Genesis 1 and say, oh, what God is doing there is he's actually creating a cosmic temple, that this world was meant to be the place where God dwells with his people. It's what a temple does, right? It's a place where God and humans dwell together. But then the second thing we need to see, that's kind of the first building block. The second one is this, is that all of Genesis 1 is actually leading and pointing towards the seventh day of rest. The seventh day when God rests from his creation. We tend to think that the sixth day is kind of the climax of God's creation, and there's a sense in which it is. When we think of God's creative work, it's very clear that humanity is like the pinnacle of that. It's only after God creates image bearers that he says, it's very good, right? But if we were to look at the whole of creation, it's actually aiming us towards the seventh day for us to see that that is ultimate. Again, let me just highlight how Genesis 1 sets that apart really quickly. So first, the seventh day is the only day that God blesses and he sets it apart as holy. So the first thing called holy in the entire Bible is the seventh day. It's pretty interesting. Time. He establishes time as holy. Further, Genesis chapter 7 falls outside of the structured pairs of the 6 days that we looked at last week, right? Day 1 and day 4, day 2 and day 5, day 3 and day 6, all kind of go together, space filled. Genesis 1, the seventh day, stands outside of that, right? It's separated from the rest of the structure. We would also say that further, the number 7 appears all throughout Genesis chapter 1. So that first sentence in Hebrew, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, that's 7 words. The second verse in Hebrew is 14 words. So it's like 7 times 1, 7 times 2. There are repeated key phrases, words like God, earth, heavens, it was so. All of those things are repeated in multiples of 7, so 14 times, 35 times. I could just keep going on and on and on. But if you were an ancient Hebrew studying this beautiful work, this literary work, and you were looking, you would see 7 imprinted all over the place. But then maybe most significantly is this: the seventh day doesn't end. Did you notice that? Day 1, morning and evening, the first day. Day 2, morning and evening, or evening and morning, second day. Evening and morning, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. You get to Genesis 7, and it's like this is a never-ending day. There's no end to it. Now, we might think, what's going on there? But again, Genesis is trying to get us to see at some level that the seventh day is what humanity was created for. It's not supposed to end. It's not supposed to be something that just stops in 24 hours, but it's supposed to some extent, last into eternity, where humans created to dwell in the presence of God, rest with God, and have fellowship with Him. Now, I understand that's a lot for us to handle. It's a lot to take in, okay? But here's what I want us to understand at its most basic level. Church, you were created with the great purpose that you might know and fellowship with your Creator. That you might know Him, that you might commune with Him. This is Michael Morales, who wrote a phenomenal book, Biblical Theology of Leviticus, which you can imagine is just so exciting. And this is what he says about Genesis 1. This is amazing. He says, this engagement with the divine is what and what alone can fulfill the purpose and potential for the image of God. Not merely, listen to this language, not merely as keeper of the lower creation, but as lover of the fathomless uncreated. In short, humanity was created for the heavenward gaze, the human soul, for a life of prayer. This is what he's saying. He's saying you were made to know God. You were created to dwell in His presence and to be known by Him, which means that your purpose here on earth can only truly be fulfilled. Humans can only really be who we were meant to be to the extent that we know and love and worship the one who created us. That's just part of our DNA as humanity. And church, I just want to say this right here is what makes Adam and Eve's rebellion and subsequent expulsion from the garden, which is what we're going to see later in Genesis chapter 3, such a tragedy, right? Because it's a departure from the very thing that makes us human, right? It's not just like, oh, they had this nice garden and now they're gone. Like, we should be reading Genesis 1 and saying, oh my goodness, can you believe it? Like, they were created to be in the presence of God. How will they now function outside of that? How can they be who they are? How can they truly be human, expelled from the presence of God? And we're going to see in Genesis 4, 5, 6, it's not good. It is not pretty when humans live in separation from the person they were intended to be in fellowship with. But then the other thing is this. This is why the gospel is such good news. Because, we often think about the gospel. We talk about the forgiveness of sins, which is awesome. We talk about the fact that we are spared from the judgment and the wrath of God, which is really, really good and amazing. We speak about the fact that God's Spirit makes us new. We become new creations. That's awesome. That's really amazing. We're united with Jesus. That's awesome. All of those things are really good, but they're really good because those things work together so that our fellowship with God will be restored. Like the Bible knows of no picture where God's like, all right, you're good. No more sins. Go your own way. And we're like, oh, good. Like, if that is our view of the gospel, we've missed it entirely. Like, that falls utterly short of what we were created for and what God did for all of us in sending His own Son. Because it's not just that we get out of wrath and judgment, but we get God. A way is open for us to be restored to our Maker. Like, this is the good news of Genesis chapter 1. This is Hebrews 10. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places, it's tabernacle language, Eden language, by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that He has opened up for us through the curtain, that is through His flesh. And since we have a great high priest over the house of God, that's tabernacle and temple language again, let us draw near. Let us draw near in fellowship and in love and in communion and in worship. And then this is Revelation chapter 21. This is where all of this is headed. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, they will be His people, and God Himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. And He who is seated on the throne said, behold, I am making all things new. So as we look, I want us, church, to understand our future as material and as earthly in the new heavens and the new earth, not as some immaterial existence in a world where we can enjoy this good world that God has created. But notice, on that world, the first thing Revelation 21 says about the new heavens and the earth, the best thing about it, God will be there and He will dwell with His people. Yes, there will be no more suffering. Yes, there'll be no more tears. Yes, God himself will wipe away every tear, but God will dwell with man. That's Revelation 21's way of saying that the thing we were created for will in the end be true. The thing you were created for, church, will in the end be true. So there's a lot of things that we could say about that, but I would just want you to ask yourself, like, what is the direction of your life? Where are you headed right now? We've all got this vision of like where we're going. We've all got this vision of what the good life is and how we're going to get there. We've got this kind of subconscious plan in the back of our mind, and we're working towards that, whether that's career, whether that's family, whether that's some form of retirement, whatever that is. Genesis 1 says that all of those things will be sorely incomplete and lacking if at the bottom of all of those, fellowship with your Creator is not number one. Fellowship with your Creator is not number one. Now, I want us to see here, and we're wrapping up right now, the Genesis picture of what it means to be human. I want you to see that that's not only true, but it's also much more than that. It's beautiful. I would argue it's much more compelling than any other vision of humanity that's on the market today. So much more compelling. And I would argue that it actually accords with our own human experience. It's satisfying. Like, it makes sense of what we feel and think about the world. We know we're not an accident, right? We feel that. We know we were made for more than just a short life and then whatever else comes next, right? So when we look at the scriptures, we see that God has given us identity that's not based on our warring and shifting internal desires, but on the foundational reality that we've been created by a loving God and that we reflect Him. It's a far more stable, far more beautiful way of understanding. It's far more in line with reality. The book of Genesis brings purpose to what you do with your life. You are not just occupying yourself for a short time until you fall back into non-existence. God has given you dominion. You are in some way a king and a queen over His creation, ruling and reigning over that, using your gifts and your skills and your talents for the good of your fellow human and for the glory of God. And then finally, Genesis invites us to know and fellowship with the one we were made for, a life in the presence of the triune God of love. And in a world of desperate loneliness because of radical individualism, Genesis invites us into fellowship with Him, the one we were made for, and life in the family of God. Like that, there's nothing else that offers you all of those things, honestly. You go look, you go study, ask questions. What does this worldview say about what it means to be human? And you will find nothing like what the Bible says about what it means to be a human. It's a beautiful and compelling picture. And I just pray that we would learn to let that be the foundational way that we think about ourselves.